think you can take it away. Once again, we want to thank Muki for staying up late and being with us and helping us see something outside of our four walls or the walls of our house. Welcome back to Israel. And here's Muki.
Okay, so hi, good morning to everyone. And we're going to get straight in because the Galilee is actually a very small area, but it is jam-packed with things to see. And the opening slide that you see is a typical Galilee scene. We see a lot of green, we see a lot of water, we see a lot of agriculture. And that's what we're going to be exploring as we go ahead. So let's get on our way. And as usual, we get onto the bus, some familiar faces that you'll see around you, and off we go. So what exactly is the Galilee? Where exactly is the Galilee? The Galilee is a district that is fertile, that is mountainous. If you look on the little map, you will see Haifa, and you will see the Sea of Galilee. If you drew a line from Haifa across the Sea of Galilee, that is pretty much the area that we're talking about. It's a mountainous area, not terribly high, around about 700 feet. It's a wet area. It gets between 35 and 47 inches of rain a year, depending on where you are in the area. And that's the area we're going to be exploring now. Where does the Galilee begin? The image that you can see over here is taken from a part of the country that we didn't get to visit on this tour. And even though Israel is a tiny country, there are areas that you're never going to get to visit. This is standing on the northern edge of Mount Carmel, looking out over a valley called Jezreel, Emek Yisrael. And this valley is where Galilee traditionally begins. We can make out some mountains on the other side of the valley, and the further north we would go from here, the deeper we would get into Galilee. The mountain that you can see with the cursor, that mountain over there is Mount Tabor. A beautiful view from the top of that mountain, but not one that we're going to be able to see on this trip. We instead are going north along the coastline, and our first stop is the city of Akko, sometimes also spelled A-C-R-E, Acre, but I'm using the Hebrew pronunciation for the city here. This is the city of Akko. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a port city, an ancient Phoenician port city, an ancient port city in which the rabbis of the Talmud lived, an ancient, an important Crusader city, and a significant Muslim city as well. The city of Akko is jam-packed with old buildings, very impressive Crusader ruins, and there have been excavations. This, for example, is one of them of the so-called Templar Tunnel. The city of Akko was a port city, so you needed to export, if you were a Crusader that is, from the east across the Mediterranean back to Europe. And one of the ways of making sure that your produce got safely to your port was through a series of underground tunnels. When I started guiding, so 25 years ago, we didn't yet know about this tunnel. We knew about underground sites, but we didn't know about this tunnel. This tunnel was only discovered when a woman in Akko had a plumbing problem. And the plumbers came to fix it. They said, this looks like there's some kind of construction down there, and almost no reconstruction. They just had to empty out the garbage, which is one of the reasons why the city gets UNESCO heritage status, because of the Crusader ruins that were just covered up. They weren't mostly even destroyed. They were just covered up by the people who came later on. We're going to continue northwards from Akko to the very, very northern edge of Israel, the very northern edge on the Mediterranean, to a place called Rosh Hanikra. Rosh is a word that's probably familiar to many of you. You know the word from Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the new year. You know the word from, you may know the children's song about the head as well. Rosh Hanikra is the head of the grottos, and we can see the cliff face with the cable car going down. The cliff face goes right up to the sea, and the sea has carved out a whole series of natural caves into the rock. During the period of the British Mandate, the British laid a railway line from Beirut to Haifa. The railway line ran along this area over here, again, that I'm moving with the cursor. And to make the railway line, they drilled some tunnels and made it accessible to the caves without having to swim there or row there. During the War of Independence, Israeli forces blew up the railway line. We didn't want enemy access into the country through that area. And since then, it has remained just a natural site. So what we can see is just one of the many different vantage points of the natural caves. And I have to say that no matter how often I go there, the interplay of the water and the light gives us a very, very different landscape, very different image each time we go to the caves. The caves are still being eroded. On stormy days, there's no access to the caves because the waves come up that high. But most of the time, we're blessed with the kind of view that you can see in the slide ahead of you. Okay, we've moved all the way up the coastline to the very northern border, and now we're going to head inland. On the way inland, we're going to pass through forests. Now, this is very different to the landscape that we saw down in the Negev on our first tour. And this is different to the urban landscapes of Jerusalem or the coast. We see green already now in June. The green is mostly gone on the hillsides. We haven't had rain, and like California, things change color. But the forests, of course, are still there. And those forests, some of them are natural forests that are still in place, but most of them are planted forests. Some of you may have in your childhood been given a tree planted in the land of Israel, or collected money to plant a tree in the land of Israel. So these are the forests that you see, both to regreen the landscape, but these forests also give us an opportunity to recreate. There are hiking trails in the forests. There are picnic tables in the forests. There are children's playgrounds set up in the forests. And of course, once they started to plant the man-made forests, which have some problems, they're man-made forests used to be mono-species, all pine or all cypress or something like that. What we can see in the top picture is mixed forest, because as there was more and more forest, the natural forest also started to recover. And the Galilee, or Israel as a whole, is very proud of the fact that we're unique amongst countries that had more trees in 2000 than we had in 1900. Most of those trees are in Galilee because the climate in Galilee is such that it allows the trees to do very well. We're now heading to a city. I use the word city. It's not really very big. There are less than 100,000 people in the city of Tzfat, but it does have a hospital. It does have, it's a teaching hospital, a university hospital. It has a college, but that's not what makes Tzfat a special city. Tzfat is a city up in the mountains. It's a city at 2,600 feet above sea level. And Tzfat is actually one of the 4 holy cities of the Jewish people. The other cities, of course, being Hebron, Jerusalem, and Tiberias that we'll still get to visit. Tzfat is a city that becomes important only in the 1500s. Two significant events happen that lead to the creation of Tzfat. The first of these events is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, in 1492. In 1492, you guys know the song, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but at the same time as Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, Jews were fleeing Spain. And they went to Muslim countries. They didn't go to Christian countries because they were expelled by Ferdinand and Isabella, Catholic king and queen. And so they went to Muslim countries where they thought things would be better for them. And significant amongst the places they went to was Turkey. In 1516, Turkey conquers Galilee. And immediately, Jews that had been living in Turkey moved to Galilee, and they begin to build the city which existed, but they begin to build it as a Jewish city. One of the things they will build are very many synagogues. We can see over here the synagogue of someone called the Ari. The Ari is probably the single most important rabbi of the Kabbalistic period. Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism. And why in Tzfat? Well, the story of Jewish life had ended in the land of Israel, in Galilee. And so these people saw it as very significant that it restarts in Galilee. They come to Tzfat, they build a whole lot of synagogues, and they develop Jewish mysticism, which is today called Kabbalah, and has been made famous by Madonna, although what she practices is probably not that similar to the Kabbalah that we know. This is one of, like I said, a large number of synagogues in Tzfat, but it's not the only thing people do in Tzfat. When I was a young guide, I thought that the next thing was a four-letter word, shop. But in fact, Tzfat is also it's really one long alleyway filled with stores and galleries of Jewish art, of Kabbalistically inspired art. In addition to being, it's kind of a curious mix of a little town. Half the people are these mystics, and the other half are artists, and they make, some of them I guess are both, and they make their peace. This little alley that you see is the main shopping alley of the city of Tzfat. The next site that we're going to see is the city of Rosh Pinna. And again, when I say the term Rosh Pinna, there's a word you've heard already, Rosh. Once again, Rosh Pinna is the first settlement of the Zionist movement. And Rosh Pinna means cornerstone. It was the first stone that they were going to put in place to start a magnificent settlement all the way across Galilee and across the land of Israel. 16 families, they gathered on one street, this picturesque looking street today, mostly uninhabited, rundown buildings, was where these 16 families gathered. And unfortunately, they suffered terribly from bad air. Or that's what they thought. Bad air, malaria, bad aria air. Of course, today we know it's the female Anopheles mosquito, but the pioneers in Rosh Pinna were decimated by the mosquitoes. But gradually they clawed their way forward, and they created this settlement and a whole lot of others that were to form the basis of Jewish life in Galilee and Jewish life in the land of Israel going forward. If we're talking about pioneers, We'll pick up on the story of pioneers in a few minutes, but we're going to head now down to the Sea of Galilee. When I say down to the Sea of Galilee, that's because the Sea of Galilee is below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is actually more than 700 feet below sea level. And the Sea of Galilee is a lake. It's called the sea, but it is fresh water. And it was a source of life for fishermen. Those of you familiar with the Christian Bible will know that many of the stories of Christian life take place as fishermen over here. Those were Jews who lived around the sea back then. And the Sea of Galilee was historically 1/3 of the modern state of Israel's water. Today it's only about 1/4 of the state's water, because today we are able to desalinate water coming out of the Mediterranean Sea and coming out of the Red Sea. But the Sea of Galilee remains significant in Israel, both for its as a source of water and also because it is a place that Israelis go on vacation. You can see this picture is taken with some picnic tables in the foreground. There are hotels that dot both in the city of Tiberias and that dot their way around the Sea of Galilee. And on the other side of the sea, and the arrow is pointing at it right now, on the other side of the sea is the Golan Heights. We will go to the Golan Heights later in our trip, but I want you to notice that the Golan Heights are flat. As opposed to the mountains of Galilee, the Golan Heights are flat, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to, well, most of the Golan Heights are flat, when we get to visit on the Golan Heights. The Sea of Galilee was the site for pioneers as well. And if I spoke about Rosh Pina as being the first wave of pioneers, people that arrived in the 1880s, what happens here on the shores of the Sea of Galilee is the pioneers of the second Aliyah. And the pioneers of the second Aliyah are the people who actually built this country. The name, David Ben-Gurion, the name, Burl Katz-Nelson, those names may ring a bell. Most significantly, you will see the tomb in front of us says on it, Rachel. And Rachel is the name of one of the matriarchs in the Bible, along with Sarah and Rebecca and Leah. But this is not that Rachel. This is a Jewish woman named after that Rachel, who arrives in the land of Israel as a young woman in her late teens, not planning on being a pioneer. She's going on her way to Florence to study art. She gets inspired by the landscape. She comes to settle on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. In a long and tragic story, she will contract tuberculosis, and she is not healthy enough to live in the area and to live on the kibbutz. And she eventually leaves, goes up to Tzfat, and eventually down to Tel Aviv. And she writes poems of longing for the place that she once loved, for Galilee. And you cannot go through a year of Hebrew literature in the Israeli school system, and you cannot go through a day without listening to music on Hebrew radio without coming across one of the poems written here by Rachel. I want to draw your attention, just next to the tomb is a little box over here. This lid can be lifted, and inside that box is a collection of her poems. I have two friends, one who brought his now wife on their first date there, and the other one who brought his now wife to propose right here. Kind of, some people say at a cemetery, but there is something romantic about her poems and about this place. We spoke about the pioneers, and I couldn't get two pictures with the exact same angle, but what you can see in the picture of it at the top is a picture taken in probably 1912 of a group of pioneers down in this valley, down in the valley, probably around about where the arrow is. But what's noticeable about this picture is there are no trees in the background or in the foreground. It is drab and harsh. Even though there was a lake, the landscape around the lake looked like the landscape of the Golan Heights, because the summer in this area is searing. The summer in this area is in the hundreds and very humid. They weren't sure that they could do agriculture here. But as you can see in the lower slide, they absolutely could do agriculture here. And this area is a prime agricultural area, especially for dates and bananas. We're going to be exploring other parts of the Galilee in a few minutes, and those other parts will be known for different kinds of agriculture. But this area, because of the high temperatures and the high humidity, is good for dates and for bananas. In the background over here, and again, those that are paying attention will see the cursor showing you, this area over here is Jordan. That is the mountains of Gilad. That's Jordan. This valley separates Jordan from the Golan Heights. And that's, again, an indication of how small the country is. The city of Tiberias. The city of Tiberias that we can see is a city on the slopes of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Kinneret. The name Tiberias is a name of a Roman emperor. The city was built in honor of a Roman emperor, or named after a Roman emperor. The Romans loved the city because on the shores of the lake there are hot springs, and the Romans used to love their hot baths and to take the waters. That was how the city began. The city becomes important in the Jewish story after the destruction of the temple, when Jerusalem is in exile, and the people in the Galilee come to, or the Jews that are still in the land of Israel come up to Galilee, come up to this province, out of sight, out of mind. The Romans don't disturb them. And it is here that they will redact the Talmud. Or rather, the first layer of the Talmud, what we call the Mishnah, is written here in the city of Tiberias. Today, Tiberias is a small administrative city. It has a hospital. It has a whole lot of hotels along the waterfront. The lower picture shows you what the sea looked like 2 years ago, after we had had 6 bad years of rainfall. The lake is now full all the way up to the wall over here, because we had 2 very good years of rain. And I don't know if there are other countries that will have it in their, in the daily newspaper, what the level of the Sea of Galilee is. Has it gone up? Has it gone down? How much it's gone up? How much it's gone down? But that dates back to the days that we weren't desalinating, and this was a real indication of how much water we had and how significant the water was. You can also see a boat over here. I'm showing you. The Sea of Galilee is a place where people go on pleasure rides. Christian pilgrims go out in smaller wooden boats, reminiscent perhaps of Jesus and the fishermen, and Israeli groups tend to go out in these big pleasure boats for cruises out on the Sea of Galilee on the lake. Where does the water in the Sea of Galilee come from? The water in the Sea of Galilee comes from the Jordan River. Now, some of you may have grown up hearing some of those Southern spirituals, or may have grown up singing The river Jordan is deep and wide. Hallelujah. Well, if you look at the picture, the river Jordan is not deep and it's not wide. A couple of years ago, I took some friends from Israel to South Africa, and we were driving and we kept crossing rivers, and they would say, "What's the name of the river?" And they were like small, insignificant rivers whose names I didn't even know, and they were probably each 2-3 times the size of the Jordan River. The Jordan River is significant because of the story that the Jordan River tells us. Because the Jordan River looms so large in biblical stories, both in the Jewish Bible and in the Christian Bible. And the Jordan River flows from the snow of Mount Hermon down into the Sea of Galilee. In the summertime, you can go rafting down the Jordan River. Sometimes I have people who come excitedly expecting to do white water, and I have to let them know that you can certainly raft down the Jordan River, but there's only one small rapid that you go over. Mostly it's not white water rafting. But nevertheless, when most of the country is the harsh desert that you saw, and even the central part of the country that I live in, is not desert, but does not have many flowing rivers in it, to come up to Galilee and see the Jordan River, even if it's not that deep and it's not that wide, is a significant thing for those of us who live in this country, and normally for tourists as well. North, we're still heading north. So we're at the Sea of Galilee, and now we've headed our way northwards. You can still orient yourselves to the mountains, and what you can see is swamp. Now, this was called the swamp 100 years ago. Today, we would call it a wetland. The same Jordan River that comes down from the mountains settles in the wetlands. It drops a lot of the sediment that it has been carrying as it comes down the mountain, and this swamp acts as some kind of filter before the water flows its way down to the Sea of Galilee, to Lake Kinneret. In the 50s, Israel had been draining swamps all over the country, and the decision was to drain this swamp as well. It had very negative environmental connotations on the Sea of Galilee, because all of the sediment that used to settle in the swamp was flowing down to the Sea of Galilee. It also impacted on the farmers in the areas. Although the farmers got more fields, the birds that migrate north-south, and we'll talk about the birds in a moment, didn't have a swamp to stop and feed in, so they would stop and feed in the farmers' fields. And in general, it was not as successful a plan as possible. And so in the 90s, a decision was made to reflood only about between 10 and 15% of the original swamp, but it has been dramatic from an environmental point of view. Most significantly is the birds. There are all kinds of birds, 500 million birds. That's the right, not 500,000, 500 million birds come through this valley twice a year in the Great North-South migration. So at the end of the European summer, the birds head south to Africa, and the end of the African summer, the birds head back north to Europe. Most significantly, we have these common cranes. That's the birds that you see up at the top. And there are 10,000 breeding pairs who decided the conditions here were so good that they didn't have to go down to Africa, and that our winters are mild enough for them to nest here. And most significantly, that reflooded swamp has provided enough food for the cranes to live there. And the farmers actually supplement the food for the cranes to make sure that they don't come into their fields. There are also many other significant birds. mostly stopping to refuel before the arduous flight over the big deserts to the south of us. There are birds in this reserve. There are bikes. Because it's in this valley, this flat valley, it's a very, very easy place to bike. And for those of you that have not been or not been in a while, a fun thing to do is to bike. If you don't have the energy to bike, you can golf car. And it's also possible to do, as we see in the lower picture, which is a tractor trailer. The cranes and the birds in general are used to farmers farming alongside them, and they don't fear them or flee. So they've now adjusted a tractor with a trailer, which enables people, and believe you me, people that are not bird watchers, sort of intrinsically, when you go out amongst 10,000 cranes, it's almost a spiritual moment. Certainly it is for me. This is something that is very rarely seen. They look like they're made of plastic. They look like they're made of plastic and then painted with some kind of bright acrylic paint. This picture is very close. They're probably 6 inches long, 8 inches maybe. The adults and babies can be much, much smaller. These are salamanders, highly protected, endangered amphibians that live in the swamp and live on the edges of the Jordan River and live in Galilee. And they look like they're painted. I couldn't even find a picture, and I have never seen the Galilee painted frog. The Galilee painted frog became extinct when the swamp was drained in the 60s. And when the swamp was reflooded in the 90s, no one expected that the Galilee painted frog was still around. But apparently some of them survived with hardly any of their ecosystem. They're now making a comeback. They're still critically endangered. But I'm yet to see one. Even the salamanders I've probably seen 7-8 times in my life, and I'm up in the Galilee and touring in that area pretty often. We have many other animals. I'll just show you 2 of them. The animal on the top is what we call a swamp cat. That is not a domestic cat. And it's probably, when it's standing, the height of an Alsatian dog. I mean, it's got very long legs. It's slender like a cat, but much, much taller. And it hunts and fishes, and it does very well as well in the reflooded area of the swamp. Very, very rarely seen, although I've been fortunate to see them. The animal down at the bottom is an animal that we see a lot. It's called a nutria or a koipu, and it is a South American animal, bred in many parts of the world for its fur, brought to the land of Israel because people wanted to make fur hats like you see ultra-Orthodox Jews wearing. But in our climate, they didn't produce the fur they needed to produce. And because they didn't produce the fur that they needed to produce, someone released them instead of killing them or sending them back to South America. And they are now visible in quite large numbers throughout the Galilee, in all the rivers and streams, and in the Hula swamp. It seemed that they were going to keep growing in number, but it turns out that the swamp cat quite likes the taste of the nutria, and so their populations are being held in check. And the swamp cat, which was also endangered, not in the world, but endangered here in the land of Israel, is making a comeback because there is a lot of good food for the swamp cat. I've been speaking about nature a lot, but important to remember, of course, that Galilee is a significant agricultural area for us, a significant agricultural area, and all kinds of agriculture gets done in Galilee. Down in the south, we saw what we spoke about, bananas and dates. Up further north, we have citrus fruit, we have deciduous fruit, we have grapes, we'll talk about grapes a bit more, and we have all kinds of field crops. Notice in the lower picture where you see the field crops, you also see the Jordan River looking very straight. The reason that the Jordan River is straight over here is because when they drained the swamp, they built canals to take the water out of the canal and to take it south. And so this is actually an area where the Jordan River flows over here, and it flows somewhere else as well, because this is one of the canals that was built to drain the swamp, dug by tractors, a pretty straight line. I mentioned citrus, I mentioned some of the other crops, but the biggest export of the land of Israel is no longer citrus fruit. The biggest export of the land of Israel is avocado. Agricultural export. Obviously, we export high-tech, we export diamonds, we export other things, but in terms of agricultural export, avocados are by far the most significant export that we have. They grow avocados down in the part of the country that I live in as well, but the Galilee is prime avocado growing area, and where once upon a time there would have been big orchards of citrus, today there are a lot more orchards of avocado, because avocado is a much more lucrative crop to grow. Okay, and moving on from the avocados. I mentioned water. We've been talking about water, but one more image of water. This is called the Banyas waterfall. The very northern part of the Jordan River is actually a series of small streams that flow into the Jordan. These small streams together form the Jordan River. The biggest and most important of them is one called Dan. Yarden, to go down from Dan, actually ends up making the word Jordan. This is another one of them. It's called Hermon. The water is crystal clear. The water is very cold because it's melted snow, and even if you're there in the middle of the summer, the water is still cold. By the time you get down to the Sea of Galilee, the water has had a chance to warm up. This is an image taken in the summertime, and when you look at the sun in the summertime, you see, as I mentioned, that green turns to a beige as the plants dry out and turns to dust. This is a jeep ride off the beaten track on the Golan Heights. Now, there are roads on the Golan Heights. People can go up onto the Golan Heights in their air-conditioned bus as well. But very often we go onto the Golan Heights in jeeps off the beaten track to get a taste of the ruggedness of the Golan, and also to visit some of the former Syrian observation posts that used to loom over the land of Israel. Why is the Golan Heights a height and not a mountain? I gave you the clue before. I showed you the flat mountain, and the Golan Heights is flat because it is actually lava flow. Unlike the Galilee Mountains that are tectonic fold mountains, the Golan Heights is basalt, lava flow, very, very different to anywhere else in Israel. Almost all of the rest of Israel is limestone, except for a small area that we saw all the way down near Eilat of granite. This is the Golan Heights. Now, this is the top picture that you see is an aerial view of the Golan Heights. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this mountain and the next one and the third one. And actually, there would be some more off screen the other way as well. Those are the extinct volcanoes from which the lava that formed the Golan Heights came. You also see agriculture. This agriculture, mostly vineyards. The Golan Heights is perfect wine growing country, both because of the rich red basalt soil and because of the cold winter temperatures and warm summers. To the north, you can see this snow-capped mountain that will reach up to 6.5, almost 7,000 feet. Only about 5% of this mountain is in Israel. Most of it is in Syria, all of that part there. A small part of it is in Lebanon as well. Mount Hermon, that's the source of the Jordan River. That's the source of the Sea of Galilee. That snow melts and flows down into the rivers and flows all the way by pipes down to the Negev and is used in the agriculture all the way down there. The Golan Heights is also Israel's only ski slope, open a few weeks a year. Most years, this year, there was a lot of snow, good snow. It was open a little longer, but it's not a, it doesn't have a very long season. Having grown up in Africa and arrived in Israel as an adult, I have never skied. But this is a picture actually of my wife and children sledding. You can go up to and Israelis typically will go up to the Golan Heights every couple of years in the winter up to Mount Hermon to get a taste of snow. Occasionally it does snow in Jerusalem. Very occasionally it snows in other places. But in order to get a taste of this, we make our way up to the top of the Golan Heights, to Mount Hermon. Now, there is one more special thing to mention about the Golan Heights. In the 1880s, when the very first settlers arrived at Rosh Pinah, they also settled in a place called Zichron Yaakov, and a little while later, some others settled in a place called Rishon LeZion. Rosh Pinah was not suitable for growing grapes, but the other two were. And so in the early 1880s, Israel's wine industry begins. Unfortunately, they were thinking of making wine as ritual wine, and the wine they were making was basically an Israeli version of Manischewitz that they sold to the Jewish world to make kiddush, to do havdalah, to say l'chaim at a wedding or a bar mitzvah. All of that changed in the 1980s. In the 1980s, Israelis are more affluent. Israelis are more likely to enjoy a good glass of wine with their meal. And because of that, they Hermon wine, the bottle that you see, the Golan winery, decided to start making upscale good wine. And that process was followed by many, many other wineries. Today, there are around about 200 wineries in Israel, some of them small boutique wineries making only a few thousand bottles, and some of them big producers like the Golan Heights winery making several million bottles of wine. The Golan Heights has become a recognized, medal-winning wine growing area. One of my personal favorite things is to do wine tasting tours, especially when I'm not the driver. The Golan Heights is an area where like in the area of California, or like in France, or like the area around Cape Town, you can drive, and every 5 minutes you're at a different winery and get a taste of very, very different wines. Because although the Golan Heights is a very small area, it has areas on the slopes of Mount Hermon at very, very high altitude. That's where they can grow the German wines, the ice wines, those kinds of whites. And it has areas down near the Sea of Galilee that are only a few hundred, about 1,000 or 1,200 feet above sea level, in a much more humid area. That's where they grow some of the reds and everything in between. So we've done a tour of the Galilee and a tour of the Golan, and all I can say at this point is lehitraot, l'chaim, until we meet again. I'm drinking tea, not wine this evening, but you'll always be able to reach me through the J or through Debbie, and I'm of course right now happy. We have some time. We have 10 minutes as planned to answer any questions that people may have.